Hello class, it's Mr. Fiore. For class today you are going to take notes as you listen to the video explaining the information on each slide. Please open up your notes on your iPad. I'll give you a second or two to do that. We are going to pick up where we left off yesterday in class. Alrighty, so yesterday we left off talking about the Etruscans' contributions to the Roman civilization. We talked about how the Etruscans contribute to Roman architecture. Today, I know some of you have this already. That's okay. You just have to listen to me for a few seconds. Alright, I'll try to make it not super painful, or for those of you that get tired and bored of listening to my voice, but I know some of the classes do not have this slide of notes, so that's why it is up. The second contribution that we are going to talk about that the Etruscans contribute to the Romans was language. Right? That was language. You may want to make a number 2 next to that so you have it for future reference. Now, we know the Romans spoke Latin, but what they borrowed from the Etruscans was their alphabet. Right? And if you remember, we talked about it, I think, earlier this week on Monday, that the Romans borrowed the Etruscan alphabet, and the Etruscans developed their alphabet from the Greeks, who were in the southern part of Italy. The third contribution that the Etruscans made to the Romans were certain customs, and one custom the Etruscans had was fights of enslaved people. Now, the Etruscans would have fights of enslaved people when a famous Etruscan general or upper class individual or ruler died. At the funeral, they would have 2 slaves fight to the death, and the slave that died would basically be the sacrifice for the person who the funeral's for. And the Romans took that Etruscan custom or tradition, or another word for custom you can maybe write in is tradition, and they pretty much took that custom and they brought it to a larger scheme, and they developed gladiatorial games. And the Romans, as we will talk about this a little bit later on in the chapter and more in chapter 8, the Romans enjoyed their gladiatorial games in which men would fight other men to the death, or a group of men would fight a group of men to the death. Men would fight animals, women would fight dwarfs. I'm not talking about the 7 dwarfs, alright, Snow White. They weren't fighting Dopey, Grumpy, alright, and Sleepy. Alright, dwarfs as in, people that, little people. And they would also have fights between animals. Alright, they would have 2 lions fight each other, or 2 other animals fight, and they would fight to the death, and you would pay to go to these events. Alright, they got enjoyment from it. Alright, we know this is, not something we would see it's something we don't see in our society today, but this was a big part of Roman culture, and it was a big tradition in ancient Rome, and they kind of developed it from the Etruscans' fights of enslaved people at funerals. You want to make sure you know the Etruscan contributions to the Romans. Could be something pretty important in the future, so you may want to star it. Alright, my star was a little fat. Alright, you may want to just star it for the future. That way, this is something you should look at when studying for a test, or maybe a quiz, or even trimester exam. As you now know, the Romans were influenced a lot by the Etruscans, but after about a little bit over 100 years of being ruled by the Etruscans in the city of Rome, the Romans kind of got tired of being ruled by a monarch. Alright, the Tarquins grew cruel, specifically. Alright, the last ruler of the Tarquin dynasty, Tarquin the Proud. May want to write in last ruler of Tarquin dynasty. And in 509 BC, upper class Romans, who we'll talk about a little bit later today, they're known as patricians, they overthrew Tarquin the Proud. They viewed him as a very cruel leader. They wanted to have more of a say in the government, and they set up a republic. All right, a republic is a form of government in which the leader is someone put in office by citizens with the right to vote, right, which is the government that we have in our country today. All right, the president, senators, members of the House of Representatives, they are all put in office by citizens with the right to vote. Right, they did not pay their way into office, or they didn't inherit that position from their father or grandfather or mother. And the Romans were basically people from the city of Rome, that were tired of Etruscan rule. And there were two major class divisions in the early republic we're going to talk about on the next slide. The patricians and the plebeians. And these two class divisions are based on the Etruscan model. The Etruscans had these two class divisions in their society, and they each played a very different role in Roman society, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Alright, so I'll give you a second to make sure you have everything filled in on the slide. If you do miss anything on the slide, you can always watch this video again. It'll be on my website for the next few days, and you can watch it there. So the two class divisions of early Rome were the patricians and plebeians, which we saw on the last slide. And we know that the patricians were the ones they overthrew the Etruscans. And pretty much you were a patrician or plebeian based purely on birth. In the early days of the Republic, you were either patrician or plebeian based purely on birth. So if your father was a patrician, you would grow up to be part of this upper class of Roman society. If your father was a plebeian, you would be part of the plebeian class or lower class of Roman society. The noble patricians considered themselves privileged and better capable of ruling, which is why they made up Rome's governing class. They only made up about 5% of the population in ancient Rome. Only 5%. It's not a lot. And the patricians believed certain people were born to lead and others were destined to follow. And patricians, preached that message so much that the plebeians believed in it for quite some time. The patricians claimed that they had special knowledge of the gods and therefore served as custodians of religious law with the authority to punish any offenders. Besides just being the wealthy landowners and pretty much the governing class of Rome, they were all Roman citizens, which meant that they had the basic rights to vote. They were required to pay taxes and serve in the army. The plebeians, the majority of the citizens, were denied any part in how or by whom they were ruled. They were not allowed to serve in the government early on. They were artisans, shopkeepers, owners of small farms. They made up the majority of Rome's people. Some historians say that was approximately 95% of the population. Just like the patricians, the plebeians were considered Roman citizens, so they did have rights like to vote, and they were required to pay taxes and serve in the army. In the early days, their social status was much less than patricians, to a point that marriage was forbidden between two classes. So if you're a plebeian boy, you couldn't marry a patrician girl, and you could not hold office, as I said before. Make sure you fill everything in on this slide. Again, this is something pretty important right? Knowing the different descriptions of each class division. If you want to write in upper class and then lower class, so you know. I know my handwriting is sloppy. Just do your best. Alright, and again, you can watch this video on my website later tonight if you miss anything. Alright, and then also recognize the similarities between these two groups. They had 3 similarities: right to vote, pay taxes, and serve in the army. Now the plebeians eventually got tired of being ruled by patrician officials, and in the 400s, Rome saw the beginnings of what came to be known as the struggle of orders, or a conflict between the patricians and plebeians. In 462 BC, plebeian official, all right, by 462, all right, there were a group of officials that would kind of sit in on patrician government meetings, and they would kind of just make sure that plebeians' concerns are being addressed to the government. And one of those officials proposed that a group of officials establish a written law code. And there was much debate to this. Right, up until now, 462, there was not really an established written law code. The patricians kept all the laws to themselves. Right, they didn't always share it with the plebeians, and when a plebeian got in trouble, they didn't necessarily know what the law was. And tradition says that the Romans sent a committee to Athens to research laws, right, that were written in Athens. And this tradition is still being debated by historians, but supposedly, Rome sent a committee there. And nevertheless, when the committee returned from Greece, from Athens in 451 BC, 10 patricians were elected to write new laws for Rome, and they produced 10 tablets. And those 10 tablets were debated by the government, by government officials, by the Senate, praetors, consuls, and they allowed them to comment on their laws. And then next year, in 450 BC, some patricians and plebeians wrote down 2 additional tablets of laws. And these tablets, the 10 original ones and then the 2 additional ones, became known as the 12 tables. And the 12 tables are the basis for laws in ancient Rome. Schoolboys had to memorize them. I'm not going to make you memorize them, so don't worry. And they're the first code of written law in ancient Rome. They became the foundation of Roman law, and they established that Roman citizens are treated equally, patricians and plebeians. There's much debate whether they were carved on bronze or wooden tablets. I have bronze tablets in your notes. You don't necessarily need to know bronze or wooden. And they were placed in a forum. However, we do not have the original 12 tables. When ancient Rome was invaded in the AD 400s, the tablets were supposedly destroyed. We do have copies of them, but we do not have the original ones. In these 12 tables, there were statements about, so what you would find in these, there are statements about legal procedure, how the courtroom would operate. Granted a man the right to make a will. I would write what I'm writing in. Granted a man the right to make a will. And it also established a form of contract. And a form of contract in ancient Rome was to be done face to face. You couldn't send anything through email. They didn't have email back then, obviously. But through paper. You had to do it face to face. And one person would say, "Do you promise?" To carry out whatever he was going to carry out. And the other person had to respond, "I promise." And there was a witness there. And there was a law concerning that if you broke that promise, there would be punishments. And as we will learn, in these 12 tables, there was also, the Romans were big on public punishment. All right. Were you publicly punished if you broke a contract? Well, it depends on the contract, and it depends on the crime that was committed and the contract that was broken. All right. So understand that the 12 tables are the first code of written law in ancient Rome. They apply to the patricians and plebeians and are the foundation of Roman law. And know some things that were written on these tablets. All right, they're called the 12 tables, all right, but they're written on tablets, either bronze or wooden. Legal procedure: a man had the right to make the will. Public punishments, contracts, laws on contract. There's a lot of other information on these laws. You don't need to know it all. We're not going to go through it all. But just so you have an idea of where was Roman law from. And supposedly they got it from the Athenians, right, which we just learned about last chapter. Alright, so now that we just talked about Roman law, we're going to talk about the parts of the Roman Republic, or the components of the Roman Republic, the different groups of people that made up the government. And the Romans had a tripartite form of government, or a three-part government. The group that ran the government were the consuls. Alright, we're going to talk about them a little bit more tomorrow. Alright, we won't get to them today. They won't be on this presentation. One group made the laws, and that was the group that made the laws was the Senate. Right, and I know that there were two consuls, all right, 300 senators. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, but just so you have it down now. And the group that served as the judges were praetors. You should know this from your homework on Monday night. All right, and there were 8 praetors. Now, this is very similar to the components of our government today. We have a group that runs the government. All right, the executive branch. All right, we have a group that made the laws, that makes laws, Congress, and then we have the judicial branch. All right, that's big news. All right, we just had Donald Trump appoint a new Supreme Court judge, all right, to fill the position that was open. And what was different about the Roman Republic compared to our government is there was no separation of powers, and there were certain checks and balances, right, between each part of the government. Just like there are certain checks and balances in our government. There are, for example, Donald Trump appointed a Supreme Court judge, but that appointment has to be approved by Congress. If Congress approves that appointment, then a person will become the Supreme Court judge. Right? So there's certain checks and balances. Now, that is all for the notes today. All right, we'll continue more tomorrow. What I would like you to do now, if there's time left in class, is you can take out the homework and you can get started on the homework assignment. All right, the Chapter 7, Section 1 worksheet. I'll be checking it tomorrow in class. If you finish that, study for your quiz. All right, there's a lot of notes on this chapter. Start making Quizlet cards. And if you have any questions on these notes, I'll designate some time tomorrow in class to go over it. Or you can see me in the morning. Again, if you missed anything in this video, you can always watch the video again on my website. Have a good day.